Welcome to the Drift and Ramble podcast. I'm Steve Blizin. Each episode will explore true stories and American legends. From the pages of history and a few stories handed down over the years, we'll look at the people, places, and events that helped shape a nation. Stories of survival, notable frontier men and women, explorers who struck it rich, and the outlaws that stole it from them. There'll be studies of saloon girls, swindlers, banditry, and bad men, profiles of lawmen and American Indians, and the good and evil that existed between them. We'll amble through the past, we'll delve into the folklore of the times, and maybe even uncover a ghost story or two. So, saddle up, or settle in, for the Drift and Ramble podcast. Due to the graphic nature of this episode, listener discretion is advised. This is episode 23. On September 23, 1805, and with no government authority to do so, a U.S. Army lieutenant named Zebulon Pike creates a treaty with Dakota leaders to acquire 100,000 acres of land. This so-called treaty is ratified by Congress, and even though the treaty is not an official government act, it becomes the basis of government claims on the land near the confluence of the St. Peters and Missouri rivers. Thus begins a long, cold deception of the Dakota people. Over the next 55 years, the Dakota and neighboring tribes will be manipulated through false promises, broken treaties, and lies. They are told they will be allowed to keep their hunting grounds and homelands in perpetuity. But the whites have other plans. With each new treaty, the Dakota are pushed further and further from their homeland and are made dependent on the U.S. government for food and supplies. By 1858, the same year Minnesota would become the 32nd state, there are more than 150,000 immigrants and European Americans living in the Minnesota Territory. By comparison, in 1851, their population was just 6,000. The U.S. government seeks more land to accommodate this influx of settlers. As a result, 26 Dakota leaders are pressured to negotiate yet another treaty. Through the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux and the Treaty of Mendota, the bands of the Lower Sioux ceded nearly 24 million acres of land. The U.S. government paid the Dakota an annuity the equivalent of 3 cents an acre. In the treaties, the U.S. set aside 2 reservations for the Sioux along the Minnesota River, then later declared these were only intended to be temporary. The U.S. government is making efforts to force the Sioux out of Minnesota. The Upper Sioux Agency was established near Granite Falls, Minnesota, while the Lower Sioux Agency was established about 30 miles downstream near what developed as Redwood Falls, Minnesota. The Upper Sioux were not satisfied with their reservation because of low food supplies, but because it included many of their old villages, they agreed to stay. The Lower Sioux were pushed out of their traditional woodlands and were dissatisfied with their new territory, which was mostly prairie. The Dakota agreed to sign a treaty. Chief Littlecrow is present for the signing, along with other leaders. Wisely, the Dakota request a copy of the treaty. Upon signing the copy, they are asked to sign a third paper, which they believed to be a third copy. But they were tricked into signing traders' papers because interpreters had not accurately described what the document meant. This separate traders' paper paid $400,000 of the promised treaty annuity to fur traders and mixed bloods, who had financial claims against the tribes. Not only are the Dakota deceived into a mandatory repayment program, the debt was far more money than they believed they owed. After 4 long months spent in Washington, D.C., the Dakota are forced to sell the north half of their reservation in exchange for goods and annuities and the continuing right to live on the southern strip of their reservation. While the Dakota are being squeezed onto smaller and smaller bits of land, the U.S. government provides very little oversight or accountability through its Bureau of Indian Affairs. the simmering tensions begin to boil in what would eventually culminate in the Sioux Uprising or the Dakota War of 1862. As the tensions begin to boil among Native Americans, a tall, slender figure emerges from humble beginnings. He exercises political genius to advance his career. He is a mostly self-educated, lean and lanky lawyer named Abraham Lincoln, who secures the Republican Party presidential nomination through his oratory expertise and an uncanny ability to pit his political opponents against each other. Mr. Lincoln would become a polarizing figure in American politics. He is elected president and takes office in March of 1861. One of the prime tenets of his presidency is equal rights. 20 years prior to his presidential campaign, in 1840, Lincoln meets and courts a young and attractive Mary Todd, the wealthy daughter of a slaveholding family in Kentucky. They were set to be married in January of 1841, but Lincoln had second thoughts, and he calls the wedding off. But by November of the following year, Abraham and Mary Todd have rekindled their courtship. On their wedding day, someone asked a nervous but freshly coiffed prairie lawyer where he was headed.
"Well, don't you look fancy? Where are you off to, Mr. Lincoln?"
"To hell, I suppose."
While the first shots ring out at Fort Sumter, signaling the start of America's Civil War, a plague of cutworms destroys crops grown by the Dakota on their reservation. Dakota men, women, and children scavenged for what food they could find. Their arms weak, their legs small and frail, their stomachs distended with the classic signs of starvation and malnutrition. President Lincoln's Indian Affairs appointee, Thomas Galbraith, is rumored to be grossly incompetent. What he lacks in experience, he makes up for in drink and arrogance. Galbraith measures his success in haircuts and conformity. He believes a strict, Christian, by-the-book approach is the correct way to handle the Dakota people.
Christianity and its handmaid or daughter civilization are at war with the customs of the Indians. To be clear, the habits and customs of white men are at war with the habits and customs of the Indians. The former are civilization, industry, thrift, economy. The latter are idleness, superstition, and barbarism. I have already stated with what tenacity these savages cling to their habits and customs. Major Thomas Galbraith, Agent, Indian Affairs.
Yet Chief Littlecrow, the spokesman for the people of the Mystic Lake, did try to get along with the customs of the U.S. He had been present and signed the Treaty of Mendota, and he had visited President James Buchanan in Washington, D.C. He replaced his native clothing with trousers and jackets with brass buttons, joined the Episcopal Church, and even took up farming. While Lincoln struggled to unite a divided nation, at home, his wife, Mary Todd, was becoming increasingly harder to deal with. Considered to be coarse and pretentious, she proved to be a challenging partner for her presidential spouse. Mary suffers from migraine headaches, depression, and wild mood swings. She has difficulty navigating in Washington's social circles, as well as in her dealings with White House staff, solicitors, and the press. While the president exercised great restraint in his dealings with Mary, he is obviously angered when her secret and wild overspending eventually surfaces. She has only been in the White House for 2 months, and yet she has already spent the entire 4-year term budget redecorating the White House. To make matters worse, she hid the extravagant spending from her husband. When it is finally discovered, the president is forced to make his wife's indulgence known to Congress. In April of 1861, with their remodeling budget already exhausted, Mary Todd Lincoln purchased a set of White House china. The president must ask Congress to appropriate more funds just to pay Mary's bills. In Minnesota, Rumors begin to fly that monies allocated for the Dakota people's annuity payments were deferred by Congress to help pay for the new White House china. The money has to come from somewhere. Meanwhile, years of pressure and abuse from local fur traders and encroaching white settlers turned the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs into a cesspool of corruption so rampant that in January of 1862, George E. H. Day finally reports the Minnesota situation to Abraham Lincoln.
The whole system is defective and must be revised, or your red children, as they call themselves, will continue to be wrong and outraged, and the just vengeance of heaven continue to be poured out and visited upon this nation for its abuses and cruelty to the Indian. George E. H. Day.
Lincoln takes no action. The Civil War, which everyone had hoped would be over by Christmas, was not. It was taking up all of Lincoln's time and energy. In the spring of 1862, Congress passes the Homestead Act. It offers millions of acres of free land to settlers with minimal requirements. To qualify for 160 free acres, all settlers have to do is live on the land for 5 years, farm, and build a permanent dwelling. Land that the government paid the Dakota people 3 cents an acre for could now be purchased at $1.25 an acre. In barely 4 years, the government was selling this land at a profit of nearly 42 times what it had purchased it for. 75,000 people would move to Minnesota over the next 3 years. By June of 1862, tensions on the reservation are unbearable. Government annuity payments, typically made in gold, were late once again. This abbreviated letter is drafted and sent to Thomas Galbraith by Reverend Dr. Thomas S. Williamson, a missionary at the Sioux Agency.
June 2nd, 1862. Honorable T. J. Galbraith, U.S. Agent for the Sioux Indians. Dear Sir, I am requested by your Dakota children to write you. Cloudman says bands of Sioux are gathering in anticipation of payment for their lands sold at the Treaty of 1851, and if they do not get it, they will kill all the Indians who dress like white people, and all the white people, and burn all the houses. And on this account, wishes you to have a larger number of soldiers here. He estimates 300 to 400 tents are killing buffalo near the James River. That more Indians are expected to arrive. I think it probable from 50 to 100 warriors, and possibly 2 or 3 times that number, may come here in 2 or 3 weeks. This is the report as told to me by the Cloudman. But for the fact that many men from Minnesota have gone to the war, and these distant Indians hear very exaggerated reports of this, which may lead them to think the frontier is wholly unprotected, these reports might merit very little attention. However, I think it is desirable when the Indians come here that they see as many soldiers as they have in the past years at the time of payment, as it seems very desirable that you should be here when the Indians arrive. I would suggest that you return as soon as you dispose of your business in St. Paul. I hope you will not suffer anything which I have written about in this letter to be divulged in such a way as to cause panic or alarm in the white settlements. We are not alarmed here, and I think there is no occasion for anything of the kind. And I write this that there may be none in the future. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, Thomas S. Williamson.
Sioux Agency, June 14th, 1862. Clark W. Thompson, Esquire, Superintendent Indian Affairs, St. Paul, Minnesota. Sir, authentic information has been furnished to me that the young Tenay Indians, in large numbers, are to visit Yellow Medicine, prior to and remain during the annuity payment for 1862. As nearly as I can ascertain, their intention is to make demand for what they claim to be their share of the annuity money, and also for certain goods for which the government bought for them heretofore and which they refused to take or failed to get. They make threats which I deem wise to provide against, and hence I ask that you furnish forthwith at Yellow Medicine at least 150 soldiers to preserve order, to protect life and property, and prevent the unusual panic incident to the payments at that place. I annex copy of a letter received from Reverend Dr. Williamson, a most estimable and devoted missionary who has spent most of his life among the Dakotas, upon whose word I have the most confident reliance. I have many other letters of the same purport, but from other reliable sources which I omit. My own information from Indians and others is substantially of the same kind. Troops ordered should have tents, transportation, and rations for at least 15 days, and should report to me at Yellow Medicine on or before June 25th of 1862. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, Thomas J. Galbraith, Sioux Agent.
For Chief Littlecrow, these were troubling times. Tensions continued to build. Cheating traders, inept and corrupt Indian affairs agents, congressional failure to pay for land mandated by treaties proved unquestionably that white men could not be trusted. As the number of Dakota began to swell in anticipation of their annuity payment, the crowd becomes unruly. Food rots in warehouses of the traders, while the Dakota continue to starve. Chief Littlecrow counsels his people to remain peaceful, but they are obviously frustrated. Indian Affairs Agent Galbraith writes Lieutenant Sheehan to request his help.
Upper Sioux Agency, July 27th, 1862. Sir, I have to request that you detail a small detachment of your command, and with it, that you proceed forthwith in the direction of Yellow Medicine River in search of Inkpaduta and his followers, who are said to be camped somewhere in the region, having in their possession stolen horses, etc. You will take said Inkpaduta and all Indian soldiers with him prisoners, alive if possible, and deliver them to me at the agency. If they resist, I advise that they be shot. Take all horses found in their possession and deliver them to me. A party of reliable citizens will accompany you. They will report to you and be subject to your orders. 10 or 12 men, in my opinion, will be sufficient. They should by all means be mounted on horses or mules. You should take at least 9 days' rations, and should start with sufficient time before daylight to get away without the knowledge of the Indians. While I recommend prompt and vigorous action to bring these murderers, thieves, and villains to justice, dead or alive, I advise prudence and extreme caution. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, Thomas J. Galbraith, Sioux Agent.
At Fort Ridgely, Captain John S. Marsh tells a contingent of braves that the military will not support the local traders in the collection of debts when the annuity payment arrives. The braves take this as a victory and ride off to celebrate the news with their villages. On August 4th, 400 mounted Indians and 150 more on foot surround the warehouses at the Lower Sioux Agency. They point their guns and taunt the far outnumbered military forces on hand. Only a strategically placed howitzer cannon keeps the braves at bay. Galbraith again refuses to distribute any supplies until the annuity payment arrives. Although he had promised that payment would arrive by July 20th, Galbraith can do nothing about the delays caused by Congress. But Galbraith's broken promises culminate to prove that he is not a man of his word. To his credit, he orders his men not to shoot and instead calls for a council. A few days later, Chief Littlecrow confronts Galbraith as provisions are distributed at the Upper Sioux Agency. Galbraith promises he will immediately distribute food to the lower Indians. Again, that promise is not kept. The bands and villages of Indians begin to lose faith in their chief's ability to speak for them. Lieutenant Sheehan is not a fan of Galbraith. He would later state,
I was present when the agent consented to the issuing of the rations to the upper Indians and told Littlecrow and his men that they would immediately issue rations to the lower Indians. That promise was not kept. I think that probably the immediate cause and the real cause of the grievance of Littlecrow and his men and the Soldiers' Lodge were not issuing those rations as agreed to. Lieutenant Timothy J. Sheehan.
On August 13th, Galbraith arrives at the lower agency to a crowd of 100 or so Dakota. Littlecrow makes his final appearance as speaker for his people. Again, he confronts Galbraith.
We have waited a long time. The money is ours, but we cannot get it. We have no food, but here are the stores, filled with food. We ask that you, the agent, make some arrangements by which we can get food from the stores, or else we may take to our own ways to keep ourselves from starving. When men are hungry, they help themselves.
The interpreter refuses to translate Littlecrow's message. This leaves Galbraith confused. He turns to missionary John P. Williamson and requests that he translate Littlecrow's speech. After hearing what Littlecrow has said, Galbraith, unable to act on his own accord, seeks counsel with the local traders who talk briefly among themselves. Finally, one of them replies,
"Whatever Myrick does, we will do."
But Andrew Myrick is disgusted with these proceedings. He stands ready to leave without speaking. Galbraith demands a response. Myrick then turns from the door and angrily replies,
"So far as I'm concerned, if they're hungry, let them eat grass, or their own dung."
Williamson again translates these ominous, spiteful words.
There was a moment of silence, followed by savage whoops and wild gestures, with which the Indians disappeared.
Andrew Myrick's statement, combined with Galbraith's inaction, enraged the Sioux leaders. Chief Littlecrow would later document this statement, along with Major Thomas J. Galbraith, as reasons for starting the Dakota War. The local traders refused to extend any further credit to the Indians based on these resentments and headlines that the Confederate Army, not the Union soldiers, is predicted to be victorious in the outcome of the Civil War. The Mde-Wakanton leaders hold council and decide Littlecrow will no longer speak on behalf of their people. Littlecrow, Big Eagle, and Traveling Hale are each in consideration for the position. They elect Traveling or Passing Hale to speak for their people. There is some protest among the council, but it doesn't last long. Big Eagle recounts his memories of these events.
We had politics among us, and there was much feeling. A new chief speaker for the tribe was elected. There were 3 candidates, Littlecrow, myself, and Traveling Hale. After an exciting contest, Traveling Hale was elected. Littlecrow felt sore over his defeat. Many of our tribe believed him responsible for the sale of the North 10-mile strip, and I think that is why he was defeated.
With their crops ruined, their land disappearing, and their people starving, the Dakota are forced to face a stark reality. The American government is focused on anything but equal rights for Native Americans. Tribal leaders meet and agree that something must be done to drive out the whites. The War Council, or Soldiers' Lodge, advocates use of force to acquire food for the Dakota people. All the while, Agent Galbraith contends that annuity payments would be arriving any day. But in his mind, the Native Americans were not to be trusted.
Confidence men and Jeremy Diddlers are among the Sioux. At least some of them will lie. A few will cheat and steal. Nearly all are beggars, and treachery is not unknown among them. Thomas J. Galbraith, Sioux Agent.
Though the $71,000 in government annuities did finally arrive in St. Paul, Minnesota on August 16th and was immediately sent off to Fort Ridgely, it was too late to ease the growing tensions. On August 17th, 4 young Dakota men steal eggs and kill 5 settlers near Acton. The Soldiers' Lodge convenes in a session that would last from midnight until dawn. Chief Littlecrow knows that troubles have come upon his people, and the young men had started to war. A witness states that Littlecrow first resisted fighting with the whites.
He at first opposed the movement with all his might, but when he saw he could not stop it, he joined them in their madness against his better judgment.
Littlecrow's own son recalls that his father resisted against war until he was called a coward. This angered Littlecrow and caused his emphatic reply.
Littlecrow is not a coward, and he is not a fool. Braves, you are like little children. You know not what you are doing. The white men are as many as the leaves in the forest, while the Sioux are only little herds of buffalo left scattered. You are fools. You cannot see the face of your chief. Your eyes are full of smoke. You cannot hear his voice. Your ears are full of roaring waters. Braves, you are little children. You are fools. You will die like rabbits when the hungry wolves hunt them in the hard moon of winter. Littlecrow is not a coward. He will die with you.
On August 18th, a reluctant Littlecrow finds his powers restored. He leads the attacks against the Lower Sioux or Redwood Agency. Warriors attack, killing traders and government employees. One of the first to die is Andrew Myrick, who was caught trying to escape through a second-floor window of one of the agency buildings. When his body was finally found, days later, his mouth had been stuffed with grass. Warriors concentrate on setting fire to government buildings, which gives many white settlers time to escape. The Dakota continued to attack settlements along the Minnesota River Valley, killing hundreds of white settlers in the first few days. The attacks are brutal. The following accounts are from interviews documented in the book, A History of the Great Massacre by the Sioux Indians, including the narratives of many who escaped, by Charles S. Bryant and Abel B. Murch, published in 1864.
We had gone about 4 miles when we saw a dead man laying in the road, his faithful dog watching by his side. We drove on until we came to the house of David Fairbanks at the foot of the hill, about 1.5 miles from the agency ferry. 2 Indians came out of the house and shot Mr. Zimmerman and his 2 boys. I sprang out of the wagon, my 1-year-old child in my arms, and ran into the bushes. Mary Hayden.
Mr. Henderson held up a white flag, a pillowcase, as a truce, but it was not respected. They shot off his fingers and at the same time killed Wedge. Helen Carruthers.
I overtook my son Radnor, who was armed. His gun, however, loaded with nothing but pebbles. Seeing that I was pursued by the Indians who were gaining on me and that I was unarmed, he fell behind me to check the savages. As I passed, I yelled, "Shoot the Indians! Drop your gun and run!" He dropped into the grass and waited until I had passed. When I looked back, I saw the smoke from his rifle, and at the same moment, 2 Indians fired upon him. I called again, but he never rose from the grass. The 2 Indians approached him and discharged their guns again. I looked back, and they were there busy, apparently scalping him. Noble boy. He saved my life by the sacrifice of his own. Jonathan Earl.
Mr. Massapost had 2 daughters, young ladies, intelligent and accomplished. These the savages murdered most brutally. The head of one of them was afterward found, severed from the body, attached to a fish hook and hung upon a nail. His son, a young man of 24 years, was also killed. Mr. Massapost and a son of 8 years escaped to New Ulm. Justina Krieger.
I ran out in nothing but my shirt sleeves, but seeing as how they were white, I removed them and lay in a slough. Mosquitoes fed upon me, and the sun burned my skin, but I remained perfectly still where I was, as Indians took up on both sides of the slough. Peter Berkman.
The daughter of Mr. Schwant, pregnant, was cut open, and the child taken alive from the mother and nailed to a tree. The son of Mr. Schwant, aged 13 years, who had been beaten by the Indians until dead, as was supposed, was present and saw the entire tragedy. He saw the child taken alive from the body of his sister, Mrs. Walt, and nailed to a tree in the yard. He'd struggled some time after the nails were driven through it. This occurred in the forenoon of Monday, 18th of August, 1862. Justina Krieger.
White women are captured, raped, and tortured. Many young children are captured as well. Some will be held for ransom, while others may not fare as well. The Minnesota Militia Forces and B Company of the 5th Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment are dispatched to the scene, but they are ambushed at Redwood Ferry. 24 soldiers are killed. On August 19th, word of the attacks reaches St. Paul. Governor Alexander Ramsey commissions Colonel Henry Sibley to suppress the Dakota. Sibley gathers forces, but they are mostly untrained civilians. Sibley himself is a former fur trader turned politician. He is a friend of the Dakota. Although he is not regular Army, he heeds Ramsey's call and accepts a commission as colonel. But Sibley is unsure of his authority, and he fails to declare martial law. Now in command of some 1,200 soldiers, Sibley's moves against the Dakota are perceived as excruciatingly slow. Fort Ridgely, once a training base for Civil War volunteers, is attacked twice, on August 20th and again on the 23rd. The siege is finally ended when reinforcements arrive. Though many young braves and warriors got involved in the battles, most Dakota choose not to be part of the fight. The fighting spreads to the town of New Ulm. Littlecrow and his men set fire to buildings and homes. 32 settlers are killed and 60 are wounded in the battle. Though the townspeople hold their ground, more than a third of the town is destroyed. With food and ammunition supplies nearly exhausted, townspeople flee. They will not return for nearly a month. Panic surges through the remaining white settlers. Tens of thousands flee the state of Minnesota. On September 2nd, Colonel Sibley sends a burial party out to locate and bury the bodies of civilians. The burial party is attacked by Dakota warriors at Birch Coulee, and it becomes one of the hardest-fought battles of the war. The Dakota keep U.S. soldiers under siege for 36 hours before reinforcements arrive from Fort Ridgely. On September 4th, Sibley writes to his wife, expressing frustration with accusations that he is slow to act.
Well, let them come and fight these Indians themselves, and they will have something to do besides grumbling. I've told Governor R in my dispatch that he can have my commission when he sees fit, as I would be too glad to let someone take my place.
The next day, the colonel feels no less frustrated. Writing to his wife again, he repeats,
I have placed my commission at the disposal of Governor Ramsey. The responsibilities of my position are so great that I am deprived of necessary rest. I can hardly rest at all. It is hard indeed, while we are fighting and doing our best, to have a set of ninnies and poltroons abusing us at home.
On September 7th, 1862, 3 weeks into the fighting, Littlecrow sends a letter to Colonel Henry Hastings Sibley. Though it is poorly translated, Littlecrow's letter condenses decades of frustration and lies into a few terse lines.
Dear sir, for what reason we have commenced this war, I will tell you. It is on account of Major Galbraith. We made a treaty with the government, a big one for what little we do get, and then can't get it until our children are dying with hunger. It is also with the traders that we commenced this war. Mr. Andrew J. Myrick told the Indians that they would eat grass or their own dung. Then Mr. William Forbes told the Lower Sioux that they were not men. Then Lewis Robert. He was working with his friends on how to defraud us of our money. If the young braves had not pushed the white men, I would have done this myself.
Only 5 days after his first letter to the colonel, Littlecrow writes Colonel Sibley again.
Red Iron Village, Omazawakan, September 12, 1862. To Honorable H. H. Sibley. We have in Medewakatan 155 prisoners. The Sisitan and the Warpetan prisoners They are waiting for the secession what we are going to do with the prisoners. They are coming down. They're at Lake Kipari now. The words I have sent to the governor, I want to hear from him also. And I want to know from you as a friend what way that I can make peace for my people. In regard to prisoners, they fare with our children or ourselves just as well as us. Your truly friend, Littlecrow, Per Scott Campbell.
Sibley contends, however, that Littlecrow refuses to surrender. 9 settlers have died in the fighting since the first letter was written. Under intense political pressure to defeat the Dakota, Sibley and his troops arrive at Lone Tree Lake on September 22nd, but it is mistakenly identified as Wood Lake. The next morning, a group of U.S. soldiers begins to search for food and accidentally stumbles upon a group of Dakota warriors. The Battle of Wood Lake is the last major battle of the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. It is a resounding defeat for the Dakota. Sibley manages to capture about 1,200 men, women, and children. But Littlecrow is not among them. Sibley wants to prosecute any Indian who participated in the rebellion as war criminals. He orders a commission of 5 military officers to hold court and summarily pass judgment upon them if found guilty of murders or other outrages upon the whites. Among them is Major General John Pope, who wants to redeem his good reputation. Pope had recently been banished or reassigned to Minnesota by President Lincoln after his mortifying defeat at the Battle of Second Bull Run. He immediately approves Sibley's plans for swift military justice.
The horrible massacres of women and children and the outrageous abuse of female prisoners still alive call for punishment far beyond human power to inflict. It is my purpose utterly to exterminate the Sioux if I have the power to do so. They are to be treated as maniacs and wild beasts. Major General John Pope.
The hearings began on September 28th. 16 men were tried that day alone. This breakneck pace continued for 5 weeks until November 3rd, when 392 so-called trials had been conducted. In one record-breaking day, 40 Dakota were tried and convicted in the makeshift military court. The accused were hauled before the commission, sometimes shackled together in groups. They were arraigned through an interpreter, but many had virtually never set foot in a courtroom, let alone understand the language or proceedings. The charges ranged from rape, theft, and murder, but most Dakota were accused of merely participating in battles. All defendants could enter a plea, but only those who pleaded not guilty had the opportunity to speak. The prosecution called and examined its own witnesses, but it did not permit the Dakota to have counsel for their defense. One observer would later comment that the commencement and conclusion of all 392 trials took less time than the state courts would require to try one single murder case. This kind of expedience was not what our forefathers intended when they drafted the Speedy Trial Clause in the Sixth Amendment to the United States Constitution. Using the terminology of the times, at least 2 of the accused were considered to be idiots. Mentally disabled individuals with low IQs, incapable of reasoning or understanding the consequences of their actions. In one example of colorful courtroom testimony, a youth was questioned on charges of robbery.
What goods, if any, did you take from Forbes's store?
Some blankets.
Anything else?
Yes, some calico and cloth.
Anything else?
Yes, some powder and some lead, and some paint and some beads.
Anything else?
Yes, some flour and some pork, and some coffee and some rice, and some sugar and some beans, some tin cups, raisins and twine, fish hooks, and some needles and thread.
Was you going to open a store on your own account?
a blank stare from the young man was his final reply. The commission refused to recognize incompetence to stand trial. The man was sentenced to 10 years for robbery. The high-speed railroad to justice isn't the only oddity taking place in these trials. Eyewitness testimony was received as evidence by the commission for some of the murders, but most of the evidence was hearsay, second-hand information relayed by any willing witness. Witnesses claimed to see defendants whooping around in celebration or overheard defendants bragging about the killings. This was all it took to obtain a conviction. Furthermore, the commission relies heavily on the testimony of just 6 witnesses, each whom testify in dozens of trials. One of the prize witnesses was Joseph Godfrey, a mulatto who had been living among the Dakota and had taken a Dakota wife. Though Godfrey himself was the very first man tried and convicted of taking part in the massacres, the commission was impressed with his courtroom presence. Instead of recommending that he be hanged, like most of the defendants, the commission recommends imprisonment for Godfrey because he was so willing to testify against the other defendants. Even the court reporter was impressed by Godfrey and mentioned that
his observations and memory were remarkable. Not the least thing had escaped his eye or ear. Each Indian had a double-barrel gun, another single barrel, another long one, another a lance, and another one nothing at all.
Godfrey testified in more than 50 trials and was even permitted to question particular witnesses. Among the Dakota, Godfrey quickly became known as Otaku, or one who kills many. While most of the early defendants admit to participating in some sort of warfare, once word began to spread to prisoners about the death sentences being doled out by the commission, many defendants then claim they did not or could not shoot at soldiers or settlers because of poor aim, weapons malfunctions, or choice. Some testify they merely watched the melee. And for those who offered evidence that they had helped save the lives of whites and had their accounts corroborated, the commission simply ignored their testimony. The Civil War was not going well for Abraham Lincoln. He leaves matters of Indian affairs largely in the hands of subordinates. He does, however, hear from at least one ally for the Native Americans. The president is visited often by Bishop Henry Benjamin Whipple, a relentless advocate for the reform of Indian affairs. The outspoken Whipple was well known and respected in Washington. Henry Benjamin Whipple was looked to as a leader of Indian administration reform among his peers. He corresponds with congressmen, army officers, officials of the U.S. Department of the Interior, and presidents of the United States, urging all that Indians be dealt with honestly, justly, and humanely. He rails against the current system of Indian administration and wants it revised to allow Native Americans to live with dignity and decency. Lincoln once said of Whipple,
"He came here the other day and talked with me about the rascality of this Indian business until I felt it down to my boots."
By September of 1862, Whipple had begun to have an effect on Lincoln. The president wrote to Whipple that,
"If we get through this war, and I live, this Indian system shall be reformed."
But for the eloquent orator and author of the Emancipation Proclamation, the 16th President of the United States, a man nearly deified for his empathy and seemingly modern attitudes towards minorities, Lincoln was less than pragmatic when it came to the plight of Native Americans. Instead, he lets his military generals dictate Indian policy. On November 5, 1862, the commission ended its work. 392 prisoners were tried, 303 were sentenced to death, and 16 were given prison terms. Fearing an even larger uprising, President Lincoln and a team of government lawyers reviewed the trial transcripts of all 303 convicted men as Lincoln would later explain to the U.S. Senate.
Anxious to not act with so much clemency as to encourage another outbreak on one hand, nor with so much severity as to be real cruelty on the other, I ordered a careful examination of the records of the trials to be made, in view of first ordering the execution of such as had been proved guilty of violating females.
But only 2 out of nearly 400 are found guilty of rape. So Lincoln expands the criteria to include those who had participated in massacres of civilians rather than just battles. He whittles away at the list and finally provides 39 names to Sibley for execution. Of those 39 original names sent by Lincoln to Colonel Sibley, only 1 would find a reprieve. 2 days later, on November 7th, Minnesota Governor Alexander Ramsey declares that
the Sioux Indians of Minnesota must be exterminated or driven forever beyond the borders of the state. Minnesota Governor Alexander Ramsey.
The state also initiates a bounty system on Indian scalps. Bounties of up to $200 are offered for Dakota scalps. Meanwhile, nearly 2,000 Dakota women, children, and older men are marched from the lower Sioux Agency to Fort Snelling. Along the way, they are attacked by mobs of angry settlers. The Dakota are held in an internment camp near Fort Snelling. In the harsh winter conditions, nearly 300 Dakota prisoners will die as victims of illness and attacks by civilians and soldiers. The day after Christmas is bustling with excitement in the town of Mankato. It is a brisk, 25-degree Minnesota morning. The day of America's largest mass execution in history. Nearly 4,000 spectators have gathered in the streets to witness what many feel is justice being served. At precisely 10 a.m., 38 Dakota prisoners are led to a specially constructed scaffold made exclusively for their mass extermination. It is indeed a gruesome event. Just days before the execution, Colonel Stephen Miller declares martial law. He wisely bans the sale and consumption of alcohol within a 10-mile radius of the town. 38 men are guided to their assigned places on the scaffold. Many struggle to free their bound wrists. They sing a defiant, haunting, and strangely unifying death song as white muslin covers are pulled over their faces. One man puffs away at a cigar while awkwardly singing his death song through his muslin mask. Another has a pipe. These are gifts given to the condemned by spectators and reporters. The men stand tall and brave. Many have managed to free their wrists, and they now hold hands on the scaffold in the frosty morning air. One man boldly expresses his contempt for both death and white justice. Hidden in the refrain of his death song, translated later by witnesses to the execution, his death song includes words to the effect of, "If you find a decapitated body in New Ulm, with its head near its genitals, it is I. It is I." He then exposes himself to the crowd in a final and complete mockery of the trial and execution. His song claims victory, while the noose claims defeat. Three slow drum beats signal the start of the execution. The men tightly grasp each other's hands. Author Isaac Hurd describes the tension as a painful and breathless suspense. A single blow from an axe, and the rope that holds the platform is cut. Captain William Dooley, who lost several members of his family in the attack on the Lake Shettick settlement, cuts the rope. The platform swings free, and 38 bodies writhe and dangle. One of the ropes snaps, and the body of Rattling Runner falls to the ground. His neck instantly broken. His lifeless body is quickly rehung. A cheer erupts from the once silent crowd as the bodies stop swaying. The bodies are left dangling from the scaffold for a half an hour before being cut down and hauled to a shallow mass grave. As the crowds begin to dissipate, a quiet discovery is made. 2 men have been mistakenly executed. Weechank Washtadonpi, who often went by the common name of Cask, meaning firstborn son, stepped forward when the name Cask was called. He was then separated from the other prisoners for execution. The other man, Wasakun, was a young white man who had been adopted by the Dakota at an early age. Wasakun had been acquitted during the trials, but was grouped with those to be executed anyway. Before the dawn of the next morning, most of the bodies had been dug up and removed by physicians for use as medical cadavers. In March of 1863, just months following the Sioux Uprising and America's largest mass execution, the Dakota Expulsion Act is signed into federal law. It effectively bans the Dakota people from living in Minnesota. Congress revokes all Sioux and Dakota treaties, takes back lands promised for reservations, and expels the tribe from the state. A bounty of $25 was issued for the scalp of any Sioux found living in the state after the passing of the law. This law has never been repealed. John P. Williamson was a friend to the Dakota. He had been a missionary stationed at the Redwood Agency at the spark of the Dakota War. It was Williamson who had translated for Galbraith when the government translator refused to say what Littlecrow spoke during that fateful final council before the fighting broke out. Williamson traveled with the exiled Indians. In May of 1863, he wrote to his mother. The following is an excerpt from that letter.
St. Joseph, May 13th, 1863. My dear Mother, I am glad to have this time to write you a few lines, for I know you will be anxious to hear how we are getting along. For myself, I am in very good health indeed, and the Indians with us are as well as when we started. There was one small child died, and we buried it at a woodyard, a little below Burlington, Iowa. I don't get along writing very well, as I stay in a tent adjoining the Indian camp, and they keep coming and bothering me. And there was no one along for an interpreter. Lorenzo is the best English talker there is, so they want me to interpret a great deal. The American in charge is named Benjamin Thompson. Whether Agent Galbraith is going to come around and be our agent, I doubt some, though some who saw him said he expected to come in around a week or so afterwards, and Dr. Wakefield told me he was coming around with him, though I hope to never see him out here, and all the Indians wish the same thing most heartily. The Indians have a great deal of singing on the road, in the steamboat and in the cars and in the camp, and they would sing a good deal more, but wherever they sing, the whites gather around so thick that it is really unpleasant. I hope to hear from you soon by way of Fort Randall. Your own son, John P. Williamson.
Littlecrow had fled to Canada after the fighting. He was not among the men tried and hung in Mankato, but he was a wanted man. When he returned to the area near Hutchinson, Minnesota, a local farmer named Nathan Lamson sees 2 Indians on his property picking strawberries. Lamson has no idea at the time that it is Littlecrow and his son. He shoots and kills Littlecrow, and later is awarded a $500 bounty for his deed. Lincoln was viewed by most settlers as weak in his dealings with the Dakota. Many felt that he shouldn't have spared as many lives as he did. The Dakota felt this great father had done nothing for them. Henry Whipple had done a considerable task in influencing the president to attempt to reform Indian affairs, but Congress did not pass the president's Indian Affairs Reform Bill. A final letter from Hidanyanka to Chief Wabasha was written shortly before his execution.
You have deceived me. You told me that if we followed the advice of General Sibley and gave ourselves up to the whites, all would be well. No innocent man would be injured. I have not killed, wounded, or injured a white man or any white persons. I have not participated in the plunder of their property. And yet today I am set apart for execution and must die in a few days, while men who are guilty will remain in prison. My wife is your daughter. My children are your grandchildren. I leave them all in your care and under your protection. Do not let them suffer, and when my children are grown up, let them know that their father died because he followed the advice of his chief, and without having the blood of a white man to answer for the Great Spirit.
The Dakota War was over, but the Sioux did not entirely give up the fight. Many resources were utilized in preparing for this episode. Although every effort has been made to provide fact, some discrepancies may arise. I'd like to acknowledge the following resources: History of the Sioux War and Massacres of 1862 and 1863 by Isaac Hurd. Minnesota in the Civil War and Indian Wars of 1861 through 1865. Official Reports and Correspondence, Volume 2, by the Minnesota Board of Commissioners. A History of the Great Massacre by the Sioux Indians in Minnesota, including the personal narratives of many who escaped, by Charles S. Bryant and Abel B. Murch. History.net. IndianCountryMediaNetwork.com. USDakotaWar.org. StarTribune.com. NewYorkTimes.com. Wikipedia.org. For show notes and links to some of these resources, as well as a list of cast and crew for this episode, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/driftandramble. Los Angeles, 1955. A world full of glamour, prosperity, dames and danger. A place where crimes are rampant, and cops are, well, they're never around when you need one. Where can you turn when you get into a bit of trouble? Rex Riveter, Private Eye. Rex Riveter is a supremely executed, modern take on old-time radio production. The writing is spot-on noir detective work, and the voice acting is one of the best collections of pitch-perfect voice talent I've heard anywhere. Wrap it all up in a neat little package with top-notch production quality and an authentic soundtrack, and you have the equivalent of a sonic time machine. It's radio noir and so much more. Rex Riveter, Private Eye. Rex Riveter, Private Eye is on iTunes, Facebook, and Twitter. Follow them at Rex Riveter. You can find Rex Riveter and many other excellent shows as part of the Fate Crafters Network. Fate Crafters is one of the fastest-growing premium entertainment networks in podcasting today. Check out Fate Crafters on Facebook or fatecrafters.net for the complete lineup of quality shows. And be sure to check back often, because there's always something new and noteworthy. Our featured show for this episode is Rex Riveter, Private Eye. Be sure to check them out on iTunes, Stitcher, and everywhere quality podcasts are found. I want to say thank you to all our friends using the hashtag #PodernFamily. Podern Family is something everybody can participate in. Using that hashtag, you can find a series of great shows to listen to, great shows to promote, and a great community of supportive podcasters. That's hashtag #PodernFamily. Check it out. So many talented people to thank for this episode. I'm going to do my best to get through this list, and it's going to go fast, so if you're interested to learn more, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/driftandramble for show notes from today's episode. There's no cost to access this info, people, so don't be afraid. No salesman will call, and you can double your order simply by paying extra shipping and handling. Ready? Let's go. Thank you to the entire cast and crew from Audio Oblivious Productions, including a big round of applause for the following people: Austin Beach, Scott Phillips, Drew Prophet, Jeremy Hennessy, Danielle Reese, Mike Jansen. From Pulppourri Theater and the amazing audio drama chat show To the Stars, Save the Last Word for Me, Mr. Pete Lutz. From Fate Crafters Network and the incredible Darker Projects, the amazing MJ Cogburn. From The Tunnels Podcast, Mr. Robert Chauncey. From Diary of a Madman and Subject Found, Mr. Paul Sading. And from the aforementioned truly fantastic Rex Riveter Private Eye, Rhiannon and Greg McAfee. Once again, folks, you can see the entire cast credits and the roles they played on our Patreon page at patreon.com/driftandramble. Hey, are you still listening? Hey, thanks a lot for sticking around. Since you're the last one left, I'll tell you about what's coming up on the next Drift and Ramble podcast. The year is 1860, and we travel back east to meet a guy tinkering with his camera. He's just practicing his technique when he snaps an eerie image of a creepy kid standing near an empty chair. This story really isn't about the Old West, but it's in the spirit of the Old West, as we take a good hard look at the practice of spirit photography. That's next time on the Drift and Ramble podcast. Until we meet again, I'm Steve Blizzin. See you on the next installment of the Drift and Ramble podcast.